Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. It's hard to believe, but it's been a year since I released my top 10 fantasy stories video, and so it is time for an update. And I have BookTube to thank, you viewers and my fellow creators, for introducing me to some new books and changing my ideas about some books that I had already read, and so this top 10 list has changed. One thing that has made a change is that I decided to not include series that have not been completed. And so 4 of the selections from last year will not appear because they are not complete series. Of them, I'm pretty confident that eventually we will see the Stormlight Archive completed by Brandon Sanderson, so that might again appear someday. And then there is the Gentleman Bastard sequence by Scott Lynch. I am hoping that we will see that completed someday. And then there are the 2 others, which I won't get into too much, but you all know about A Song of Ice and Fire and The Kingkiller Chronicle. And so those are not complete, obviously, so they will not be appearing this year. I still love these books, and I still recommend them to people who are interested in great fantasy, but I cannot consider them top 10 until they're complete. And so the criteria that I am using for this list, other than completion, will be the same that I used last year. And I'm interested in great characters, I'm interested in themes, I'm particularly keen to see great themes. So I teach a fantasy novels class, and you can quickly see which books teach well. In other words, the ones that have great themes embedded in them. So that is something I love. I love books that make me think. And that is something that I do look for, although I also enjoy fantasy stories that are just fun as well. But I tend to favor, for my own personal taste, those that make me think deeply and have great themes included. In addition to characters and themes, I look at plot, and I look at creativity in the plot, and I also look at other factors like the influence that the series has had on the genre. I think that is fairly important. Some of the books on this list are here almost exclusively because of their importance to the genre. Not exclusively, but almost. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the top 10, and then afterwards I will mention some honorable mentions that I think are great fantasies. Frankly, there is some arbitrariness to any list of this nature. And of course, if your top 10 book, if your favorite book does not appear on this list, it does not mean I think you're a terrible person or anything like that. It just means that we have slightly different tastes and perhaps we're looking for different things in fantasy. So, with that said, let me begin with my top 10. At number 10, a book that I mentioned in the honorable mentions last year, but there's room for it now, and I'm very glad to say so. It is Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. Now, this is a series that is here partly because of the influence it has had on the genre. I recognize this is a monumental achievement that Robert Jordan, and finished by Brandon Sanderson. And I absolutely have a great deal of respect for this series. I think that it is a very important series. It is dear in the hearts of many fantasy fans. I almost wish I had been a little bit younger, so that I had been maybe in high school when this series came out. As it is, I was past high school. I think maybe I would have loved it even more if I had been in high school and reading it. It could have been very nostalgic for me as well. But that said, there's so much to love about The Wheel of Time. And among the things, it's a tropey read for sure, but the tropes are handled very well, I think. And the character arcs are just fantastic. They're vast. And it's just quite the epic to follow along. So lots of good things to say about The Wheel of Time. It is here on its own merits and also because of the great influence it's had on the genre. It is a bridge series between classical fantasy and more modern fantasy. And I think that it has a very compelling story to tell as well. It is a kind of a good and evil, as I said, kind of a trope. You've got a chosen one who suffers much kind of trope at the heart of it, but it is done very well. So, number 9 for me. This is a series that is new to me, so this is because of BookTube, and it is the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. Now, I do have to give the caveat that I have actually not yet finished reading this series. So this could change. Maybe it'll be higher, maybe it won't. I know that the ending to the series, which I don't know yet because I haven't read the final book, is a bit controversial, so maybe that will influence me at some point. But right now, I am loving this series, Dark Tower by Stephen King. I love its quirkiness. I love the fact that it is genre-defying. I mean, we can call it fantasy. I'm going to call it fantasy because this is a channel that is all about fantasy, and it certainly has some heavy fantasy components, but it also includes some science fiction and some horror, and just, it's pretty tough to categorize in many ways. But it is quirky. And one thing I love about Stephen King's writing, I did not know this because this is the first thing I've ever read by Stephen King, but this writer is unafraid to stare in the face of humanity. I mean, he is unflinching about the way he portrays human faults, our frailty, our flaws, and he gives us some memorable characters in the process. So I absolutely admire Stephen King's writing, and I regret that I did not start reading his books earlier. When I'm finished with the Dark Tower series, I intend to read more books by Stephen King. At number 8, this appeared last year on my list, and it is still here. It is a book that I love, and it may seem odd to some of you that I would pick Neil Gaiman's American Gods among my top 10, because I do tend to favor epic fantasy in my tastes. However, this, like the Stephen King Dark Tower series, is actually very tough to categorize. You could call it urban fantasy, I suppose, but it is also part road trip, and it is part mystery as well. And I love, again, the genre-defying aspect of this, but I also love the themes. Let me tell you, this is a book that teaches really well. There's a lot in here about identity that I think is a wonderful thing to include in a college class. And when I teach American Gods, it inevitably leads to some fantastic discussions. I also love Neil Gaiman's prose. I think he is among the best. And I love his characters. I love his dialogue. He does a brilliant job of establishing his characters through some amazing dialogue. And also, for those of you who love mythology, tons of mythological references in here. And there's a lot about music. So if you're a music fan, there's some great musical references if you're looking for them in this book. So there's just a lot to talk about with American Gods, a very rich story. Speaking of rich stories, my next item is going to be at number 7, the Earthsea series by Ursula Le Guin. This is nostalgic for me in the way that Wheel of Time probably is for many other people. I love Ursula Le Guin's prose, like Neil Gaiman, although very different styles, honestly. But some of the most beautiful prose, in my opinion, you can come across is in these books, in the Earthsea books. And Le Guin did a lot of things before anyone else. You have the trope of the wizard school in the first book here in A Wizard of Earthsea. And you have some wonderful themes in here. We talk about the major theme, perhaps, of Wizard of Earthsea being the acceptance of death. And I don't know any story that deals with that theme as well as Ursula Le Guin does in A Wizard of Earthsea. And it is a theme that pops up again in the later books in the series, along with other themes about gender and social hierarchy and many other things that Le Guin just handles beautifully, being a consummate author. She is just an absolute gem of the genre. And I highly recommend you read A Wizard of Earthsea. It is something different, a little bit different from modern fantasy. This came out in, I think, 1969, late 60s anyway, early 70s. And the characters in here are something that maybe modern fantasy fans would have to adjust to a bit. It is not as character-driven a story. It is a more theme-driven story. And so the characters are perhaps not as vivid as most fantasy fans like today. But to me, the themes in there more than make up for that. I mean, this book, A Wizard of Earthsea, is a meditation. It is almost like a folktale in its starkness. And that, to me, helps to carry across the theme. It highlights the theme in a way that you don't often see in modern fantasy, which tends to be more character-driven. And I have no problem with that. I love character-driven stories, too. But this is a book that, again, is conducive to wonderful conversations. And so it's one that I love. And again, it has a lot of nostalgia for me. At number 6, we have Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire series, and beginning with Prince of Thorns. I think that Mark Lawrence is one of the smartest writers in the genre today. He is absolutely brilliant, in my opinion. And even though, yes, this is grimdark, this is one of the grimdarkiest series that I've read, and I've also, by the way, read the 2 books in the Red Queen's War trilogy and love them, absolutely love them. You could include the Red Queen's War trilogy in the Broken Empire world. It is the same world. And Lawrence definitely shows his comedic virtue in the Red Queen's War trilogy, even more than in Prince of Thorns. But in terms of presenting the reader with a character that is vivid, that is complex, that is struggling, this is what grimdark does. This is why I don't consider myself well-read in the subgenre grimdark, but I do admire it. And it is all about putting your boots on and strapping on your sword and going out and facing a hostile world, a world that wants to deny you meaning. And your job is to carve meaning out of that world while you're here. And you may ultimately succumb. You may ultimately lose this battle. But the virtue is in facing it with as much courage as you can muster. And that is something you see in the complexity, particularly of the main character here. This is a character who is deeply disturbed and deeply disturbing, frankly. A lot of people have a hard time reading this trilogy. I had a hard time reading it in some ways, but I found myself rooting for this main character in spite of everything. And I think that is something that only a very rare author could pull off. And Mark Lawrence does it brilliantly in the Broken Empire trilogy. He just does a fantastic job with the characters and establishing the tone of this book. There is just so much to love in Broken Empire. Highly recommend it. Next on my list, let's continue with the grimdark vein here. My other grimdark selection in my top 10 is Joe Abercrombie's First Law series. And I say series because I include not just the original trilogy, but I include the 3 standalones and the new trilogy, Age of Madness. I love every single one of these books. I love everything that Joe Abercrombie has written in the First Law world. I still haven't read the collection of short stories. I have it, though, and I will be reading it soon, something that I'm very much looking forward to. That's called Sharp Ends. Very nice title. I like that, Joe Abercrombie. He has some great titles, great quotes in here. But what everybody loves about Joe Abercrombie, who loves this series, has to be, first and foremost, the characters. I mean, does anybody write more vivid characters than Joe Abercrombie? That's a good question, I think. His characters just pop out of the page. They are so well done, so conflicted, so interesting, and you really want to follow along with them, as flawed and as sometimes terrible as they are. You just can't help yourself. You've got to follow along with these characters. Other things that Joe Abercrombie does well, humor. The guy is, in terms of humor, I think he's my favorite author. I love Joe Abercrombie's humor. I am laughing out loud constantly while reading his books, and it's just absolutely one of the things that makes me relate to these characters is the humor in here. So he pulls that off really well, and it's very important, I think, in a grimdark world to have some laughs. So that is something that Abercrombie is just among the best. Also, his action in here, I love how Abercrombie handles his action sequences, especially when he does the perspective shifts in the middle of the action. You go from one character POV to another POV, and it's just breathless, and it's really well done. It's not just battle scenes, but in many contexts where there is something intense happening. So he does this stuff just beautifully. And I actually feel that Joe Abercrombie is getting better and better with every book he writes. For me, Age of Madness so far has been my favorite in the First Law world. And I am so excited for the 3rd book in that trilogy to come out this year. Very excited for that. And I hope I will be correct in predicting that it will cement Age of Madness at the very apex of the First Law world for me. So next on this list, at number 4 in my ranking, we have the Broken Earth trilogy. This was on my list last year. It remains. It is a trilogy that I find absolutely moving and brilliant. And it is no accident that N.K. Jemisin won the Hugo Award 3 years in a row for the 5th season and the 2nd book and the 3rd book in this trilogy. One of the things that may take some getting used to when you pick up this trilogy is the 2nd-person narration. Now, this sounds maybe weird to you, but trust me when I say that you get used to it, and eventually it works for you, and eventually you come to appreciate the pure genius of this very bold narrative risk that Jemisin takes by including 2nd-person perspective. It didn't make a complete sense for me until the very end of the trilogy. And I was blown away when I realized what she had been doing the whole time. In terms of themes, this is a trilogy that teaches really, really well. And it's because Jemisin does an amazing job of including themes in here. You have oppression, obviously. You have systemic oppression that goes back years and years and years. And as a consequence of this history, has shaped the world, the fragmented, broken world that we see immediately in the 5th season. But in addition to oppression, you have resilience. And that is something that I deeply appreciate. I came to root for the main characters, as flawed as they are in this trilogy, as broken as they are, as fragmented as they are, and as fragmented as their narration is. I came to love these characters in their imperfection and relate to them and hope for them. And that is something that I cannot say of every series I read. I was incredibly moved by the Broken Earth trilogy. And I highly recommend that you try it out, especially if you're up for something different. And that is another thing I love about this trilogy. It is a trilogy that points to where fantasy can go, what fantasy can do. Fantasy is amazing because of its capacity to meet our psychological needs and to address social problems. That is something I deeply admire in N.K. Jemisin's writing, that she does exactly that in this trilogy, and that is why Broken Earth is at number 4. At number 3, this is a change for me from last year, a big change. I actually mentioned Robin Hobb in my honorable mentions last year, but this year she has vaulted all the way to number 3 in my top 10. And it's because I read, in addition to the Farseer trilogy, which I had read by the time I made the video last year, I read the Lifeship Traders trilogy. So I've gotten further into the realm of the Elderlings. And I have not finished all the books yet in the realm of the Elderlings, so who knows, this might change as well. But based on those 2 trilogies, Robin Hobb is now at number 3 for me, and here's why. I don't know if you can name a single author who imparts the same psychological depth in her characters as Robin Hobb does in her realm of the Elderlings. I'm absolutely astonished at how real these characters come to feel for me, especially in the Lifeship Traders. They feel like people I know. They are complex. They are conflicted. They have problems. They, particularly in Lifeship Traders, the villains are sympathetic in some ways, and the heroes are people who are flawed and have their blind spots, and sometimes you feel like shaking them and telling them what's what, and it's just so well done. And the world is so beautifully fleshed out, really, in every one of these books that I've mentioned so far, in every one of these series, you have amazing world building, but Hobb really takes it to an amazing level in the realm of the Elderlings. She is, and you do have to be a little patient for both of those trilogies, Farseer and Lifeship. It's taken me a couple hundred pages to start feeling like, okay, now it's starting to roll here. It's an investment that I'm very glad I made, because it certainly pays off, because you feel so connected to these characters by the end of the story, and the last couple hundred pages just zip by because you're so invested, so immersed. And so I absolutely adore Hobb's prose as well. This is another reason why she's at number 3 for me. I think she is among the very best when it comes to prose, and that is something that I pay attention to. I like some complexity, but also I like having some range, and Hobb has range, and I really appreciate that. So for her characters, her world building, her prose, absolutely up there. Realm of the Elderlings is among the very best. And now we get to the last 2. And here's where I had my biggest problem. If you watched my video from a year ago, I made a very firm declaration that my number 1 pick would probably never change. And I have to think about this. This is something I had to think about for a very long time. If you've been following the channel, you probably already had an inkling what my number 2 and 1 might be, although you might not know what they are. This was a very tough one, let me say. Even now, I'm having a hard time getting it out. But it's time for me to admit. It is time for me to move on and acknowledge that things have changed a little bit for me. And this is because of BookTube and because of my fellow fantasy fans out there who have been so kind and so wonderful, leaving comments and interacting with me, and my fellow creators and the various discussions that I've been in. And so there are a lot of reasons for this, and I'll explain them, but I have changed my mind. And I was wrong. I was wrong about a few things last year, or maybe that's not the way to put it. Maybe I have evolved. I have evolved since last year. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that. So I declared last year that Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien would always be my number 1. Well, it's my number 2. And I still love it for all the same reasons that I loved it last year. I absolutely adore Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit. And I've also read all of the unfinished tales and other things that you can read in Middle-earth. So I am absolutely steeped in Middle-earth and its lore, and I adore it. It will always be the door that opened onto the landscape of fantasy for me. Tolkien baptized my imagination, and I will always be grateful for that. And I still love everything that I loved about Lord of the Rings before. I love the mythology that it incorporates from the Silmarillion. I love the humanity that it brings in from the Hobbit with the hobbits. I love the epic world. I love the history. I love the languages. Languages are so important to me, and Tolkien as a fantasy author convinced me that language is central to fantasy. And I love his prose, archaic as it might be. I absolutely adore Tolkien's prose. I find it beautiful. And when I think of Lord of the Rings, when I think of Tolkien's writing, that is the first word I think of. It is beauty. It is beautiful, and it elevates, and that is something wonderful. I love how reading Lord of the Rings makes me feel. It makes me feel elevated. It makes me feel cleansed. It is cathartic, and it is wonderful, and it always will be. But it's my number 2 now, so what possibly could have unseated Lord of the Rings to take my number 1 spot? Some of you might be thinking that based on all the videos I've been doing and my reread of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, that my number 1 must be the Malazan Book of the Fallen now. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is not. My number 1 is Steven Erikson's The Malazan Book of the Fallen, along with his Kharkanas trilogy, and along with Ian Esslemont's Path to Ascendancy, and his novels of the Malazan Empire. To me, you have to include all of the books in the Malazan world. As awesome and epic and amazing as the Malazan Book of the Fallen is, it is even more so in the context of the books by Esslemont and Erikson's other series set in this world. And that is something that I find incredible, actually, to have these 2 authors have created this world while gaming and given us its richness and its depth and its history and its mythology. and its archaeology and everything else. It's just absolutely amazing. But that isn't what I admire the most about this series. There are several other things. What I admire perhaps the most is the incorporation of theme. And both Erikson and Esslemont are brilliant at incorporating themes into their stories. I think they probably think about theme before anything else. I could be wrong about that, but I love how they have incorporated theme. And of course, as you all know, the heart of these books, it's about empathy and compassion. And that is something that our world very much needs. We need a lot of understanding. We need a lot of listening. And that is something I'm learning very much from these books. I also love their prose. Stephen Erikson's prose is among the very best. Talk about range. It is absolutely delightful to have comedic prose on one page and then a little bit later to have some really tight battle sequence written with short, powerful sentences, and later to have some beautiful landscape described with some just absolutely breathtaking prose. I mean, the guy's range is fantastic. And his ability to get you invested in his characters and his world is tremendous with the amount of information he gives and never hand-holding. I love that about this. I love that about this writing. So that is another thing that I admire deeply about all the books in the Malazan world. So you have the themes, you have the vivid characters, you have the amazing world building, and you have a story that is important for today. And that is something that I wanted to say. As much as I love Lord of the Rings, because it has taught me what fantasy has been about, I love the Malazan Book of the Fallen and all of the books in the Malazan world because it has taught me what fantasy can be. If Tolkien baptized my imagination, then I would say the Malazan world has set it free. And that is something that I deeply appreciate. And I think going forward, we are going to see a lot more fantasy that isn't afraid to challenge the tropes, that isn't afraid to go places that haven't been gone before. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So that is why the books in the Malazan world by Stephen Erikson and Ian C. Esslemont are my #1 fantasy story. And I do think that you have to read them all together. They are just absolutely breathtaking in their scope and in their message. So I said I would mention some honorable mentions as well, and there are just so many. BookTube has absolutely been a wonder and a delight for me because I'm learning about so many great new series. I am currently reading The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne, and that's a lot of fun. And I have also read the Poppy War Trilogy by R.F. Kuang. That one was a great learning experience for me as well. And there are some others that I absolutely adore that I mentioned last year as honorable mentions, such as Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams, and Magician Trilogy by Lev Grossman, and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I've been reading The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, and I am assured by its fans that it gets better and better, and I can see some amazing things about it already. There is the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett. I need to read more of those. I've only read a couple so far, and I know that its fans are very dedicated to it. So, and I love the humor there. And there are a couple series that I'm going to read that I have a feeling might just be challenging for a place on this list for me. One is the Book of the New Sun. That is by Gene Wolfe. I keep hearing amazing things about that. It is one I need to read this year. Another would be R. Scott Baker's The Second Apocalypse series. That is another one I want to start this year. And based on what I hear, I think I'm going to love it. And there are just going to be so many others that I haven't even started yet that I am looking forward to see. Because that's what this channel is all about. It is my quest for the best fantasy. So I am looking forward to maybe having this list change some more in a year. Who knows? We shall see. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this, and I hope to see you again. Until next time.